Hello again, this is Professor Watts, and today we are going to talk about economic institutions. So to start off our discussion of institutions, let's think about sports. And what makes sports work? Well, you have to have rules that are well known and well enforced. If the rules aren't known by the players or aren't enforced by the referees, then the game breaks down. It becomes chaotic, it becomes really impossible to play or enjoy if the rules aren't in place. The market economy is a sort of game. It's not a zero-sum game like sports where there's a winner and a loser. Remember, the market economy is based on catalactic competition, which is a win-win. So if the market economy is functioning well, we can all play the game, so to speak, find jobs to do, things to produce, ways to serve our fellow man, and that can lead to overall economic prosperity and growth. That is, if the rules of the market economy are well defined and well enforced. And so this brings us to the idea of institutions. Markets require rules, just like games do. And institutions, broadly speaking, are those rules. They can range from formal institutions, which would be the official laws and regulations promulgated by various governmental authorities, down to informal institutions. Customs, habits, things we're expected to do that might not necessarily be written down, but that help make our interactions with others function smoothly and reliably. And in economics, we have a saying, institutions govern incentives. If you change the rules, you change the results because people will operate differently under different sets of rules. Now, in this video, we're going to talk about institutions that matter for the functioning of the economy. And this will focus on those official institutions that are provided by the government. So we're looking for a competent and stable government to provide property rights, the rule of law, a sound legal system, and competitive markets. So we'll take a closer look at each of these in turn. Let's start with property rights. To understand the importance of property rights, we'll take a brief look at two polar opposite economic systems. Market economy is best defined as a system that features individual ownership of the means of production. And this term, the means of production, you should hopefully be familiar with this by now. The classical economists categorized this as land, labor, and capital, the things we need to use to produce products that we want. A socialist system, on the other hand, is defined as collective or government ownership of the means of production. So the market economy features a vastly different institutional structure than does a socialist economy. And the difference I want to focus on here is prices. Market economies are based on prices for all of those means of production, land, labor, capital, and then the products that business and entrepreneurs make in an attempt to satisfy the needs of their customers. Socialist economies, on the other hand, feature an absence of prices because all decisions are made in a top-down fashion by a central economic authority rather than by entrepreneurs seeking profits and seeking to avoid losses in a competitive business environment. And as we'll see, prices are essential because they provide both businesses and consumers with essential information about what products they might want to produce or consume, incentives to both produce products that people want and to produce them in an efficient manner, and to consume products wisely. And then, perhaps most importantly, a spur to innovation for businesses and entrepreneurs to constantly come up with more and better products and more efficient ways of producing products. And the reason these aspects of the price system are so important, you'll recall, is that scarce resources have alternative uses, as that great economist Thomas Sowell constantly reminds us. So we need a mechanism that helps us reckon with those alternative uses and choose wisely. We need a process where we can navigate opportunity costs. So this is where property rights come into play, because as we'll see, you can't have a market economy without property rights. And to help me make this point, I'm going to bring in another one of the great economists of all time, Ludwig von Mises, who wrote a very insightful book comparing a market economy and socialism. This is in 1920, when socialism was actually ascendant. Intellectuals in the West, Europe, America, thought that socialism was going to be the next big thing and was going to be a breakthrough in terms of bringing more and more people to a higher level of prosperity. Well, von Mises understood the economy very well, and he understood people and human nature very well. And in doing what he called a praxeological analysis, which is an analysis based on the parameters of human action, Mises came to the realization that socialism just can't work. Here's what he had to say, quote, "Economic calculation can only take place by means of money prices established in the market for production goods in a society resting on private property in the means of production." End quote. So what is Mises saying there? He's saying that economic calculation, now that's kind of just a fancy term for accounting, profit and loss accounting. If I run a business, do I make money or not? And that's the most important thing any business needs to know. Well, to do that, you need prices for the means of production. I pay so much money for my workers, I pay so much money for my building, I pay so much money for my raw materials, etc., etc. And you have to be able to compare the money you pay, the cost of production, against the money you earn for the products you make and sell, your revenues. And Mises is saying you can't have those prices for those inputs in those products if you don't have private property in the means of production. And therefore, without private property in the means of production, the whole economic apparatus just really can't function at all. Okay, so to understand what Mises is saying here, let's recall that a market economy means private ownership of the means of production. Without that kind of private ownership, there can be no trade of resources, no buying and selling. And if there's no buying and selling, there's no markets. And if there's no markets, there's no prices. And therefore, people are going to be at a loss when it comes to navigating those inevitable opportunity costs, and it's going to be very difficult for them to make wise decisions regarding the use of resources. What should they do with their time, their energy, their skills, their property? Furthermore, we're going to lack a mechanism to provide people incentives and to provide people with feedback about whether what they're doing is beneficial or not. That's the profit and loss mechanism. And without those kind of incentives and feedback, we're not going to have a high level of efficiency in the economy. So to paraphrase Mises here, it's not that he's saying somehow that socialism is morally wrong or evil. That would be a value judgment, and Mises is acting here as a pure economist. Economics is value free. He's just analyzing it logically and determining how it's going to work. Well, he determines that based on the lack of prices and the incentives they provide and the feedback they provide, socialism just isn't going to work in practice. And Mises predicted that in the early years of socialism, and that indeed was borne out ultimately over a course of many decades of socialist economic experiments that occurred with very tragic and terrible results through much of the 20th century. Here's another way of thinking about what Mises is saying, and this goes back to a schematic I developed in the last lecture to think about how the market process works. So in the market process, we have the system of trade, which means there are prices for all goods, and then entrepreneurs can look at those prices and see if certain business plans make sense or not. I can sell a product for a certain amount of money. What does it cost me for the land, labor, and capital resources that I need to produce that product? Is there really profit there? Maybe there isn't. Therefore, I have to look for another business opportunity, and then we test those business plans in the market, and then profit and loss is the ultimate determinant of which businesses can keep on going and grow and thrive, and which businesses will have to be shut down and let people try something else with their time and energy and resources. So remember, we have that positive feedback of profits and that negative feedback of losses. The market is a system helping us make decisions, constantly guiding us in what to do with our resources. Mises is basically just saying that all of this whole apparatus rests on a foundation of property rights, because if you don't have property, individual ownership of the means of production, of land, of labor, of capital, then you can't have trade, and you can't have prices, and you can't have that whole system playing out. So you got to have a foundation of property rights for the whole system to work at all. Now, to look at an empirical example of economies that are based on property rights and therefore can have the market process functional versus economies that aren't based on property rights and where the market economy can't function, I want to share a brief video excerpt from one of my former professors, a true genius, a wonderful man, and a brilliant economist. Tyler Cowan of George Mason University.
To illustrate the importance of all these institutions, let's look at a story that is both tragic and extreme. Here is the Earth at night. Even from space, you can see where people live by the clusters of lights. Look more closely at this area. This is the Korean Peninsula. Here's South Korea, a developed, modern economy, a very pleasant place to live or visit or work. And here's North Korea, mostly darkness, with the exception of the capital Pyongyang, where the ruling elite lives. So what's behind this divergence? The splitting of Korea into two distinct countries provides an almost perfect natural experiment to demonstrate the power of institutions. Originally, the two Koreas had basically the same people, the same culture, the same language, the same history, and pretty similar economies. If anything, the northern part was wealthier. But starting after the Second World War, the two Koreas ended up on very different institutional tracks. Communism was imposed on North Korea, but South Korea, broadly speaking, ended up with capitalism and a relatively free market economy. So what happened? It all comes down to incentives. Different institutions create different incentives. In South Korea, the prevailing incentive was for commercial cooperation. Entrepreneurs would produce goods and services which consumers wanted, and if they succeeded, they were allowed to earn profit and keep that profit. Alternatively, businesses which were not successful were allowed to go bankrupt, so capital was reallocated to more valuable uses. And a society evolved based on cooperation and trust and honest commercial dealing. So over the next few decades, South Koreans became major car producers and exporters, such as the Hyundai, producers of music on a global scale. I enjoy listening to K-pop. Movies from South Korea have taken Asia by storm, and it's a major location where women go to buy high-quality cosmetics. It's a pretty well-functioning market economy responding to consumer demands, and the standard of living in South Korea is fully that of a developed country. In contrast, in the North, there's been a totalitarian state where the economy is centrally planned and directed. Those rules meant that most people didn't have the freedom to start businesses. They weren't allowed to keep their own profit. Prices are controlled. Capital is allocated by the Communist Party. So human energies go into trying to influence politics, to try to have people you didn't like branded as political enemies or enemies of the state. The final result was tragic, and over the last several decades there have been periodic episodes of starvation because prices and property rights did not give farmers the right incentives to grow enough food to keep people well nourished. In essence, North Korea has been a militarized state where people live in fear. I've seen this difference with my own eyes. I've been to the border. When you look back to the south, it's a very pleasant, beautiful, and prosperous place. When you look ahead to the north, well, at the time I wasn't even allowed to enter the country because they were so afraid of outside influence. And as an economy, it's so backward that, as you can see, it is literally nearly black at night. Let that sink in for a second. The economy in North Korea is so underdeveloped that at night it is literally quite dark. Growth miracle and growth disaster. Light and dark. This is an extreme example, but it's one that helps make clear the importance of institutions.
So as you can see, property rights are the most important element, the most important institutional foundation for a market economy to function. And we'll look at these remaining institutional elements, but we can really kind of see them as part and parcel of having an economy, a society that is based on property rights. So the next most important thing is the rule of law, which can also be thought of as having an honest government, a government that's not corrupt. Corruption is defined as the use of power by government officials for illegitimate private gain. The reason corruption is bad for the economy is because corruption is like a tax. If corruption is common and if government officials know they can get away with it, they're going to use their power and influence in government to start skimming resources away from entrepreneurs who, in the pursuit of profits, are running businesses that create valuable products and services for the consumers. And if there's too much corruption, then there's going to be too much wealth and resources taken away from entrepreneurs, and that's going to reduce their incentives to run businesses and invest and keep the economy functioning efficiently. So, if corruption's common, businesses have to pay extra money to those corrupt officials, which reduces or eliminates their profits, and that will ultimately stifle entrepreneurship and investment in businesses and bring economic growth and prosperity to a halt. Is the United States a corrupt country? Well, there's certainly many individual examples of political corruption we can point to, but as with all economic questions, we want to put this in context. Compared to what? How bad could it be? And when we compare to the rest of the world, indeed, we'll find that the United States succeeds economically because we generally keep corruption in check, and corruption is pretty limited. It's not a common feature of our political system. It's kind of a rare exception to the rule. Now, here's some empirical data on that. This graph is plotting corruption, and I believe this is based on the Corruption Perceptions Index, which is published by an outfit called Transparency International. So they go around and ask people in all these countries how corrupt they think their system is, and then they give them a score. The score here is put on a scale from negative to positive, so it can be more easily correlated in a regression model, versus their GDP per capita, or the amount of output they produce per person in year 2000 US dollars. And you'll notice here that the United States does very well here. We have very low corruption score, so we're down here in the lower negative numbers, and we're up here towards the top of GDP per capita. And the red line here shows you the estimated relationship between the corruption score and GDP per capita. The higher your corruption score, in other words, the more corrupt people perceive the country to be, the lower the GDP per capita, which does demonstrate that idea that corruption is like a tax, and higher levels of corruption stifle economic growth and development. Okay, so let's move on. Another aspect of institutions that matter is political stability. Institutional changes in laws, regulations, leads to higher levels of risk and uncertainty for businesses and entrepreneurs. So if entrepreneurs perceive that when a new political party comes into power, they're going to raise taxes, or they're going to introduce burdensome regulations, or otherwise change laws in a way that's negatively impacts business, that might scare off new investments and entrepreneurship and limit the functioning of the market process. In the United States, I would suggest that we do very well in the realm of political stability. We have institutions that are fairly well established, and they're not subject to radical changes. Even if we have big political changes, transfer of power from one political party to another in the presidency or in Congress, they're not going to be able to make really big, sudden changes to our institutional foundation because our government is very stable and it contains a lot of checks and balances that prevent rapid and extreme change from taking place. As an example of this, I want to share with you a brief segment from one of my favorite Broadway plays.
They say George Washington's yielding his power and stepping away. Is that true? I wasn't aware that was something a person could do. I'm perplexed. Are they going to keep on replacing whoever's in charge? If so, who's next? There's nobody else in their country who looms quite as large. What? John Adams. I know him. That can't be. That's that little guy who spoke to me all those years ago. What was it, 85? That poor man, they're going to eat him alive. Oceans rise, empires fall. Next to Washington, they all look small. All alone, watch them run. They will tear each other into pieces. Jesus Christ, it will be fun.
So this is from the play Hamilton. You might be familiar with it. It's King George III reacting when he learned that our first president, the great George Washington, voluntarily stepped down from office after serving for only 8 years, which was unheard of at the time when most countries had monarchies, where the king or queen served for life. Washington's action there established a precedent in the US for the peaceful transition of power from one president to the next, and indeed from one political party to the next, which has held up pretty well for well more than 200 years since then. And by the way, if you think that the political divide between our two major parties is bitter and acrimonious now, well, I will tell you as a student of American history, it's probably not worse than it was in the 1790s between the Federalists and the Republicans. They were very vicious and very brutal to each other. And I should note, this is another aspect of the history that the Hamilton musical captures very accurately and very creatively. And yet our political and economic institutions were able to weather that, and so hopefully we'll be able to weather it again in our current day. Okay, finally, institutions that matter. Let's talk about the legal system. We want a well-functioning legal system because a good legal system provides security of property. We've already talked about how important property rights are, so those need to be identified and secured by the legal system. The ability to transfer property from one person to another, from one business to another, in a way that makes it clear who owns what, so markets can function. As a part of that, the enforcement of complex contracts, such as those relating to finance, labor, assets, and so on. Now, the United States legal system is based on English common law. Wherever English common law is the basis of the legal system, economies tend to function pretty well. Now, this isn't to suggest that English common law is the only legal system that can work for economic success, but it is one that is proven very reliable historically. Let me give you a brief lesson on common law principles. Common law is based on three cornerstones: precedent, gradual adaptation, and adversarial trial. Precedent means judges and courts must abide by established rules and norms that are handed down over the ages, over centuries even. And this makes common law predictable. So if you're taken into court by the police, or if you're sued by somebody, you have a pretty good idea what rules and what procedures are going to be applied. They're not going to be able to surprise you with sudden changes in the rules. Gradual adaptation, however, means that as judges see fit, they can apply changes to adapt the law to particular circumstances. So the law is not too rigid, and it can be flexible over time to adapt to new technologies or new ways of doing business or new societal norms. And then, perhaps most importantly, we have the concept of the adversarial trial in common law, where an accused person has the presumption of innocence. We have the right to not incriminate ourselves. We have the right to be tried not by just a judge or other people in authority, but by our peers, people who might be more sympathetic and objective in their application of the law. The right to counsel, the right to have competent legal representation. So these standards are important because they help to protect individuals from abuse by the government or by powerful people in society. Now, does this mean common law works perfectly and we never have a miscarriage of justice? No, of course not. There are tragic instances in which people have been abused even through our common law legal system. But again, the question is compared to what? And when you compare common law systems to the rest of the world, they tend to perform better in general and on average. And most importantly, they promote a very smoothly functioning market process. As an example of a sound legal system can do for us, let's take a look at another great literary figure.
Hey, cool glasses! Can I try them on? Oh! SpongeBob, your eye! It's all black and swollen! How'd you mess your eye up, SpongeBob? Did somebody hit you? Where is he? Yeah, we'll settle this like men! We'll sue him!
As Patrick suggests here, having access to a reliable legal system can actually reduce the incidence of violence. So we settle disputes with other people through the courts rather than through physical conflict and violence. Okay, finally we'll talk about competitive markets. An important lesson in microeconomics, which those of you in Econ 201 will be talking about this pretty soon, is that in the long run equilibrium in competitive markets, economic profit equals zero. This happens because businesses' profits are eventually competed away by rival businesses offering the same or similar product at a lower price. And over time, we very reliably see when competition is in place, a reduction of the real prices of various products and larger quantities of those products available for the consumer. And there's a tendency then in the market, all gains wind up going to the consumers. All gains are consumer surplus in the long run. And we're all consumers, so that's very good news. So competition is so important to having the economy function well, and good institutional environment allows for maximum competition in the provision of all goods and services. Okay, so let's wrap up by summarizing why institutions. Let's wrap up by summarizing the importance of institutions. Remember, the rules matter, whether in a game or in life. And institutions are the rules that govern our interactions with other people in society, so the institutions matter. And economic success requires a system of rules under which markets and entrepreneurship can flourish. If you take a look at a map that ranks countries based on their economic freedom, on this map you can see that the more green a country is, the more free it is, and the more red it is, the less free it is. And we could think about that as a proxy for the country's economic institutions. The greener countries have better institutions, and the orange and red countries have not so good economic institutions. And as you can see when we look at a map of countries by GDP per capita, there is a very high correlation between a country's economic freedom, or its economic institutions, and its economic outcomes in terms of productivity, wealth, and prosperity.